Good evening. My name is Eugenio Refini. I'm the chair of the Department of Italian Studies, and I'm here tonight to do the onori di casa, as we say, on behalf of our director of Casa Italiana, Stefano Albertini, who wasn't able to be with us for another commitment, teaching commitment, so a serious commitment. I mean, I'm sort of sorry that he can't be with us tonight, but I'm really happy to be here because we are introducing what's going to be, I think, a very productive evening of discussion and of viewing. So we are formally inaugurating one of the exhibits which Casa Italiana hosts. This is an exhibition curated by my dear colleague, Professor Ara Merjian, and I'm really delighted to also welcome him to the podium right away. Of course, I won't be introducing the full thing because he will do that. We will have a panel discussion before letting everybody go upstairs and enjoy both the exhibit and a lovely reception. I just wanted to say that what we are celebrating tonight is one of the wonderful examples of what Casa Italiana, in collaboration with the Department of Italian Studies and with other stakeholders around, is able to accomplish. The exhibit, entitled Arte-Azione, Pablo Echaurren and Italian Counterculture in the 1970s, really brings together many of the threads which both our faculty and our grad students, in many cases, work on. And I would like to just congratulate Ara Merjian for putting together yet another exhibit. He's been sort of responsible for other successful hits in the programming of Casa Italiana, always, really trying to work across disciplines, which is what the Department of Italian Studies does. We are called Italian Studies for one reason. We really try to reach out across literature, culture, art history, social history, cultural history. We try to do as much as possible. And this exhibition upstairs is really a wonderful example of these. It does tackle, as you all know, kind of very complex a set of years in the history of modern and contemporary Italy, the 1970s in particular. Of course, years problematic in many ways, especially if we think about the political dimension, but also years in which the arts were thriving and figures like Pablo Echaurren were kind of contributing in unpredictable ways and in ways which are also challenging. Well, for sure, the more traditional ways of thinking about art. And I think the legacy of that experience is still extremely important. And I think it's sort of particularly interesting, if not worrying, to be thinking about the attualità of this kind of artistic discourses these days. I mean, this is not just about picking something in the past which has no bearing on the present. Unfortunately, those years in many ways resonate with the present, even more than we would like, I think. I just would like to acknowledge, of course, the Echaurren Salaris Foundation in Rome, which has been a partner in crime for this exhibit. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Merjian to the podium. And thank you all for being with us tonight.
All right. Thank you so much, Eugenio. Before I start, just a number of thanks for this exhibition, which really did take a village, beginning with the director of the Casa Italiana, Stefano Albertini, who, for nearly 20 years has been just an unrelentingly, for me, encouraging and supportive colleague, and who is always the first to be excited about various kinds of programs and exhibitions and everything bound up with them. I need to acknowledge as well my co-curator, Jacopo Galimberti, who teaches at the UAV in Venice and is teaching and hence couldn't make it. But most of all, the Casa staff and individuals who worked really tirelessly to put this whole thing together. Extra special thanks to Kostya Kostic, who was just, from the start, with every sort of shipping detail to insurance to various legalese in which he's an expert, incredibly helpful, along with Chiara Basso and Julian Sachs. An extra special thanks to Giulia Lombardo, who helped install the exhibition, along with other student helpers, and I don't know if Giulia is here, but she is really just an absolutely wonderful asset. And finally to Pablo Echaurren and Claudia Salaris, who in addition to being tireless activists and scholars are really just incredible human beings, two of the kindest and funniest and most fun individuals who were crushed that they couldn't make it. This is Pablo's first exhibit in the United States. But Claudia had some health issues and had to have surgery a few days ago, so they send their best wishes. So, in histories of post-war political protest, the events of 1968 hold pride of place in the Italian and international imagination. As the most revolutionary phenomenon with global currency, in tandem with the birth of the New Left on both sides of the Atlantic, this makes sense. But the 1970s, the late 1970s, witnessed one of the most significant moments in Italy since World War II, a movement which assailed the seemingly inveterate conventions of political affiliation and even the sacred cows of 1968 radicalism, which had become rigid and encrusted in their turn. Intersected by student activism, feminist and LGBTQ critique, and a range of other practices and communities, from the underground press and street performances to free radio, the 1977 movement shifted the parameters of ideological affinity and their expression in and as culture. As of the mid-1970s, a new generation of young people began organizing and demonstrating in Italian cities, in so-called proletarian youth groups. The revolutionary activity of 1968 remained a necessary touchstone for these individuals, but a new set of concerns, social, political, sexual, and expressive, seized their attention and channeled it in increasingly collective urban activities. The height of these actions and demonstrations saw tens of thousands of students take to the streets in both celebration and clashes with police forces, occupying university campuses, but also coming up with new kinds of creative acts. And I just want to show a clip of a film which will be in the lobby for the duration of the exhibition, and which also gives us a little glimpse of Pablo himself.
Lo slogan del 68 più celebre è quello che dice l'immaginazione al potere. E invece ci sembrava che l'immaginazione non potesse avere nessun tipo di rapporto col potere, che dove c'è l'uno scompare l'altra e viceversa. Non volevamo riconoscere alcuna autorità a niente ed a nessuno se non a noi stessi.
Italia, anni 70. Il movimento studentesco si trasforma. La protesta anticapitalista e le battaglie per il progresso sociale e civile si accompagnano a una critica che investe il sistema politico e l'intera società borghese. La controcultura rompe tutti gli schemi, anche quelli ereditati dal 68, con l'obiettivo di portare una nuova creatività nelle piazze, nelle scuole e nelle università, luoghi privilegiati di incontro e di scontro. Si opera in piena libertà in cerca di altri orizzonti, con stili diversi e mezzi di comunicazione decisamente originali.
As a key site of partisan resistance and the heart of Italy's Red Center, Bologna took pride of place in these events. But the Communist Party's attempts to control and police these mass actions, even with armored vehicles, steered demonstrations away from party politics towards anti-authority and extra-parliamentary articulations. The movement demanded not simply greater rights to labor and wages, but also a defiance of the usual identikit of good proletarian progress, a right to the creative enjoyment of life. As Robert Lumley writes, the phenomenon was as much of a surprise to the New Left, forged in the wake of 1968, as it was scandalous to Communist Party officials. It was into this climate that Pablo Echaurren and his eventual partner and collaborator, Claudia Salaris, along with a coterie of friends and allies, applied their creative efforts. One of its manifestations, about which we'll hear more, was the so-called Indiani Metropolitani, or Metropolitan Indians. Leaving aside the salient questions of cultural appropriation that such a term might entail, its energy spoke to an undeniable identification with the marginalized, those embattled against an oppressive and occupying authority. One of the key figures behind the Indiani and other countercultural groups in Rome and Bologna, Echaurren, who was born in 1951, helped reconfigure the language of student and social protest as an illustrator, activist, and eventually scholar. His work over 5 decades incorporates registers both high and low, using comics, collage, caricature, and other means to reprise and transform historical avant-garde tactics borrowed from Futurism and Dada. The son of the famous Chilean-born surrealist painter Roberto Matta, and brother as well of Gordon Matta Clark, famous half-brother, American artist, Pablo enjoyed a much closer rapport with the heroic political European avant-gardes than the average individual. But like any artist forging his own place in contemporary society, these hallowed practices became objects of irony and alteration as much as reverence. One headline of the Corriere della Sera from February 1st, 1977 notably read, "A new wave of agitation threatens Italian universities. In Palermo, Sassari, Naples, numerous campuses occupied." As noted by the art historian and at the time critic and activist Maurizio Calvesi, the city of Paris was just then, these very days, inaugurating the new Centre Pompidou, a site for the cultural consumption of the historical avant-gardes. These objects and images had now been rendered museum pieces, consigned to a kind of historical inertia and preciousness. And so too did a new generation believe that the politics of 1968 seemed now a matter of nostalgia. Echaurren has described the 1977 agitations as the battle of, quote-unquote, magma against dogma. That sense of restlessness, of contingency, of improvisation as the antidote to doctrine plays out semantically as well. Imported by these activists from American English into Italian parlance, the slogan DIY, or do it yourself, speaks to an insistence on invention from below, an impetus which spoke to new intersections and realignments of class at the time as well, as more and more students became excluded from the labor market, even as more and more working and lower class individuals were earning degrees. But that DIY energy also entailed a revitalization of avant-garde strategies. Many of Echaurren and others' images and typographic experiments are hermetic, convoluted, incomprehensible, even as Pablo himself has admitted to himself after all these years. Plays on words, puns, jokes, slogans of defiance. But in both style and intent, these works constituted what Echaurren has called a language of the historic avant-garde dragged back into the streets. It was, of course, in the streets themselves where the early 20th century avant-gardes began trying to break down the boundaries between art and life, beginning with the Futurist movement, which of all the historical avant-gardes bears, of course, the most fraught legacy, at least politically. It was not only consistently over decades with Futurism and its collage practices, its breaking down of high and low that Pablo has engaged, but also the Dadaist mechanomorphs of an artist like Francis Picabia, whose abstractions also have formed the stuff of numerous experiments and plays with imagery, as well as the various iterations of ready-made by Marcel Duchamp in works that we can see upstairs. Even the title of the zine at the time, Il Complotto di Zurigo, was an homage, in a sense, to the founding of the Dada movement in Zurich. It was a time of free radio, of street demonstrations, of squats, of, as again Robert Lumley says, investing forms of consumerism into oppositional and countercultural meaning. And perhaps necessarily, our exhibition has now tamed them once again, placing these fluttering butterfly flyers under the bell jar of museological study. But in defense of that, alongside his work as an activist and artist, Echaurren has proven a tireless cultural historian, authoring numerous volumes not only on the 1977 movement and related countercultural events, many included in the exhibition, but works on art history in general, including, for example, the political legacy of Duchamp. Working alongside various collaborators, including his partner, Claudia, Echaurren really embodies the collective efforts of a generation. And in some ways, in defiance of that museological bell jar, I noticed just before coming downstairs and managed to take a picture of it that while we were installing, we had these sort of sticky posters that we then eventually exchanged for these new decals. And we were taking them off the wall, and I guess this sign lingered, and it says, sticky, don't touch. And it's improvisation, it's complete incongruity to the works on display, and the notion of a highbrow exhibition really made me feel as if Pablo and his irreverence, his playful, loving, but engaged irreverence is here with us tonight. So with that, I'd like to introduce our three next speakers. First, Matteo Ciambella is Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Italian Studies, writing a dissertation on the practice of forgery in post-war Italian political and literary culture, in addition to a number of other really terrific topics. And so I'd like to invite Matteo up to speak.
Just a second. Should be in here, perhaps. Here it is. Okay. See it? Yeah. Hi. Thank you, Ara, for your introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I will try to keep it brief and to focus on, in particular, one of the aspects that you touched upon and that also is mentioned in the video, which is sort of the context in which the works upstairs were produced, and in particular, one aspect, their criticism of militant left-wing politics. And also their position in respect to the phenomenon referred to as the riflusso nel privato, which would sort of follow in the years after 77, the retreat away from the public sphere of politics and into the private realm, which I believe the Indiani foresaw, mocked, and in some sense even perhaps embodied. Although the works exhibited upstairs mostly date from 1977 and 1978, I'd like to start actually by taking us back a decade to 1967. This is a drawing by Gianfranco Baruchello entitled Do It Yourself Confession, which I found on the website of More, a museum for refused and unfinished art projects, which exists online, and which is an initiative about which Echaurren himself has written about in an essay entitled Il non finito e il non realizzato. Gianfranco Baruchello would later also act as Pablo Echaurren's mentor and teacher. Let us look at this drawing in greater detail. I apologize if it's a little blurry up there. As we see, we have a sort of a device or a little chamber where one can administer oneself a confession. It's free, and as it says, you can confess to what or to who you want. According to the description on the museum's website, Do-It-Yourself Confession, and I'm quoting, is a project created during the period of political militancy of the artist, close to the revolutionary left and to groups like Potere Operaio and Lotta Continua, which brings together the forces that will culminate in the following year in the 1968 season. The drawing's target, end of quote, by the way. The drawing's target is indeed typical of the Contestazione and the sort of protest culture from that period, which directed its antagonism at the church, the traditional family, the party system, and particularly the sort of hegemonic Christian Democratic Party, and towards other institutions of bourgeois morality. Now let's fast forward 10 years, or 11 to be precise, to 1978, and we'll see that the kind of satire exemplified by this drawing, of course, has not disappeared, but something new as well has emerged. Here is another proposal for a do-it-yourself exercise. It was realized by Pablo Echaurren and Maurizio Gabbianelli, who we saw in the photograph earlier, in 1978 for L'Avventuista, the satirical supplement of Lotta Continua. It is essentially a do-it-yourself protest, or rather a do-it-at-home protest. The caption, if we can perhaps zoom in, reads like this. I'll read just the first half. Finally, even in your home, for those who love comfort, for those who can't keep up with the level of the clashes, for those who are afraid, for those who are sick, for those who lost their balaclavas, now you can follow the clashes from your own bed. Paste the figurines on the I think there's a little spelling mistake, typo. Paste the figurines on the carpet. Cut them, lay them on the map of your city, following the live radio reportages, be it democratic radios or pirate radios. And here are the figurines that the reader is invited to paste onto the cardboard to sort of live through this protest from his own bed. So there is all the types, so to speak, from the protest. There is the chronicler, the special team, lancio, meaning like the throwing of perhaps an object as a sort of weapon. There is all kinds of cops in different attire. There is the autonomy, right? A very sort of one of the main groups in these types of protests in those years, right? What else we have? We have the pestaggio, espropriatori, which is maybe my favorite. It's just, expropriation, and they're just running away with a prosciutto, and yeah, exactly, looters, and more. And then we have the objects. We have the let's see, cubetto di porfido, something like a stone you would throw at like perhaps a window shop or in a clash with the police, bottles, and so forth, gas, etc., etc. I think, yeah. So there is also, on the same line, a similar proposal that appears in L'Avventuista, the same magazine. And this time it's, I apologize in advance for the image quality, it's make your own flyer. So make your own political flyer, essentially. And it's a very similar concept, right? What do you need to make a political flyer? You need some cut-up letters that you can paste. There's a form, here they give you a form, cut it up, and you need to start with comrades, of course. And then you need to sign off with one of those symbols, either the fist or the hammer and sickle, the symbol of the autonomy, and so forth. So I don't mean to suggest that these images were inspired by Baruchello's. Any echo between the two works may well be entirely fortuitous. What it is interesting is that what is being satirized here, as opposed to the Baruchello drawing, through the same device of the do-it-yourself or do-it-at-home, which, by the way, while it combines what Ara mentioned, this sort of DIY culture, at the same time is also typical of commercial advertisements promising added comforts and efficiencies and turning lived experiences into commodities. So what is being satirized, I was saying, are the trappings of militant culture and militant action. Thus, the political flyer has become such a schematic and predictable format, according to the authors of this vignette, that it can be assembled mindlessly, almost like a coloring book. Indeed, the Indiani Metropolitani turned the militant activism that had taken shape around or after 1968 on its head. They too rejected, of course, the old structures of authority, the church, the family, the party system. But this was almost taken for granted, in a sense. What their own iconoclastic irony focused on, instead, were the critics themselves, the world of the Contestazione, which they felt had crystallized into another dogmatic system with fixed values, which left no room to the multiplicity of ideas crucial for self-expression. Thus, the slogans of the Indiani Metropolitani, their satirical vignettes, their flyers, their fanzines, often target, alongside the Communist Party or the Socialist Party, militant organizations such as Potere Operaio and the Autonomia. So in their slogans, il militante became il militonto, which is a pun in Italian blending the word militant and the word fool. Or potere operaio, workers' power, became godere operaio, workers' pleasure, or even potere dromedario, which is just nonsense. In the book Il mio 77, Echaurren sheds light on this turn. Referring to his and Gabbianelli's work, he says very clearly, and I will read a few excerpts. He says, I should specify that anti-fascism was not our priority. We fought against conformism on the left, or in the left. You could this is my translation, by the way. So we didn't care much about the right, meaning the right wing. It wasn't our business. And later he expands. He says, the contempt for politics was imposed as a form of duty to a whole generation, the one that came out of 68. Marches, assemblies, potere operaio, avanguardia operaia, servire il popolo, lotta continua, these are names of groups or magazines, often both. So these groups had filled the life of many, leaving space only for an ideological vision of every aspect of reality. There was no longer any freedom of choice. If something was not considered proper, left-wing enough, it was inevitably automatically considered fascist and had to be cancelled, rejected. But this omnipresent, invasive superego suddenly became cumbersome, grotesque, asphyxiating. And then speaking about his own trajectory, he says, many of my paintings at the beginning of the 70s proudly showed Marxist titles and sequences of red flags and hammers and sickles. I felt I was somehow a Marxist artist. And yet I detested politics. I was stuck in the 60s, the discovery of rock music, flower power, colors everywhere. I saw the protesters... Sorry, I'm actually going to skip this bit. And so speaking about 77 and the Indiani Metropolitani and this sort of change, he said, so many people did a coming out with great relief. They freed themselves of the oppressing weight of a culture that, in the name of an exasperated populism, had operated a heavy censorship against every type of difference. Let's move forward. Oh, okay. This I already mentioned a little bit, so perhaps I will skip and say that, as was obvious from sort of these passages that I already read, the irony of the Indiani and of Echaurren came from within the movement, and it shouldn't be confused with a conservative attack on left-wing politics. However, an image exhibited upstairs made me reflect on something else, on the peculiar historical moment in which the Indiani entered the scene, entered the Italian squares and universities and even printed culture. Because 1977 was a historical turning point in which participation in collective politics was at its peak, and certainly at its most creative and innovative, at least in the Italian case. While, however, paradoxically, the riflusso nel privato, the so-called retreat into the private sphere, was also imminent. And this is the drawing I'm thinking of. It's titled Indiani Metropolitani. It's in the main hall, right at the center. And I think what is interesting about this image is that it embodies a desire to map. It is literally a map, if we look at it, or even a timeline. However graphically playful and free, Paolo Libero, we might say in reference, sort of connecting it to the futurists, it nonetheless shows an attempt to establish a lineage, among the otherwise confusing succession of groups, subgroups, magazines, supplements, single-issue fanzines. What it maps is also the itinerary of Echaurren himself and of a few Indiani metropolitani across 1977, across different phases, groups, and publications. So this group finds its first expression, at least in printed culture, in the single issue zine Oask. I'll sort of just go through these kind of quickly now, which later the people who produced Oask produced Abajur, and then WAM, and then the Complotto mentioned above, and of course many more that perhaps when we go back upstairs we can take a look at. And looking at this image, I was reminded of something else that I came across during my research, sort of somewhat unrelated directly to this exhibition, which is a flyer by Gianfranco Sanguinetti, a former member of the Situation International, who had taken part in the movements of 1968 and 69. In the flyer in which Sanguinetti announces the foundation of a new independent radical radio, Radio Fantasma, we also find a map, as we'll see in more detail. This is from 1979, by the way. And what I'm interested in is the map. So I did some sort of bricolage here and put together the map at the top and the one at the bottom because they are a single one, and reversed it. So you can kind of see this sort of amazing, it's a little offset, but mapping of the movements and the currents that first gave rise to this explosion that is here, 1968, and then channeled into a million different sort of lineages, and eventually some of them converged into 1977, which is over there, as you see. Now, and just to conclude, it seems to me that these type of images, these recognitions or maps or timelines, for all their visual vitality, which is really amazing in some cases, express the sense that a period has ended. This is 1979, or is coming to an end. I think this impulse to document, to map, to trace genealogies, to look backward and put some order in the past rather than to theorize a leap forward towards the unknown testifies to a feeling that an age was coming to a close. And I think this is what makes, in some sense, the Indiani such an interesting movement in their specific, sort of in the moment that they appear, so to speak. Because my sense is that they represent sort of a peak, in a sense, of experimentation. And after taking certain things, including irony and subversiveness, I guess, to an extreme, while also sort of already being at the doorstep of this change in Italian society. And in fact, some members of the 1968 generation accused the Indiani Metropolitani of ushering in some extent, obviously, not the flusso nel privato, or at least of embodying it. Flusso nel privato is a term used disparagingly to refer to a gradual loss of collective political consciousness and a retreat into individualistic prerogatives in compliance with the demands of a consumer society. However, I believe instead that the Indiani Metropolitani, with their ineffable irony and their exuberant creative force, merely exploded the contradictions already inherent to left-wing militant politics in the 1970s. And I think the works included in Arte-Azione, the exhibition that we're upstairs, document precisely this moment, this peak, in a sense, in which such a force was at its maximum, sort of at its utmost freedom and experimentation. Grazie.
So I'd now like to welcome my colleague Nicola Cipani, who is clinical professor of Italian Studies and director of undergraduate studies in the Department of Italian Studies, where he teaches a range of topics including the art of memory, literature and machines, and the cultural histories of anarchism.
All right, so I'm starting from here, from Echaurren's little squares, these quadratini, these drawings with areas outlined by those dashed lines that in the newspapers or magazines of the time actually indicated that one could or should take scissors and cut them out, So those functioning almost as an invitation to look at the whole as a decomposable, reorderable mosaic, deliverable in pieces, perhaps even expandable. And I do want to start from here also because my first encounter, I didn't know that this was Echaurren, but my first encounter with a visual of Echaurren was with just such a drawing, namely the famous cover of Porci con le ali, which is a book. It was very successful. Is a success which gave rise actually to an entire editorial series, the series Il pane e le rose, which featured marginal antagonistic texts about youth or addicts, so testimonianze, so to speak. And in that particular cover, there was like the little square occupied by a winged pig. And around there were other panels with, red flags, demonstrations, fragments of naked bodies, then also some of those naked bodies from magazines, and then books and newspapers piled up on top of the other. So in a way, the cover, beyond anticipating the themes of, juvenile speech, youth and sexuality, etc., also offered a small preview of the promiscuity of codes that the reader would encounter in the book. Alberto Abruzzese has a nice essay already back in the 80s, a fine essay in which he noted on these forms of subaltern writing, I quote, that the book was lucidly drawing upon the very same graffiti that automatically layered themselves and integrated into hybrid and ephemeral forms on the walls of school toilets, barracks, factories, hospitals, asylums, and prisons. So the authors, Lidia Ravera and Marco Lombardo Radice, had, like Echaurren with his little squares, worked in a patchwork fashion on the language of the post-68 generation, on this amazing flux of eccentric, casual, transgressive, sometimes really plain batshit crazy writings. I was just an adolescent, and in fact, I don't do research on this topic, but I I'm almost like a witness in the sense that I was too young to take part, but I was old enough to absorb. I was very curious, and I saw this stuff, and there was this incredibly varied menu with these strange readings, and we would place everything on the same level. So Porci con le ali, yes, of course, and fotoromanzi and more, and all these zines that were being produced then. It was truly enjoyable. And none of the tiles of this mosaic was perhaps indispensable. Some of them were perhaps less remarkable. But it's precisely the whole mosaic of genres and types that something truly complex emerged. And it was also representative of a visual environment that had become part of everyday ecology. So the city really looked like that. Now, this is a picture of the bulletin board of, there's a picture of a French 68 posters, And compared with some walls or kiosks in Milan of the time, or even just the bulletin board of my high school, this looks rather bloodless, I have to say. It's quite the institutional version. It was much more jumbled and chaotic, really full. And so the Indiani Metropolitani, when they said that there is a desire to start over again, 68 with other weapons, as Echaurren puts it here. I think that one of those weapons, at least so it seems to me in retrospect, was precisely this chaotic saturation of the available channels of expression. This is really evident in the magazines and the zines of that galaxy, antagonistic galaxy of the time. Often, this is, by the way, OASC, which is an anagram of chaos, right? And you will see the magazine will look to you like the upper right quarter, but it's folded and it unfolds into one thing. So you see, you again have this occupation of a larger space. And if you notice how packed it is, the zines of the time were drafted with a manic compilatory frenzy, very dense, crammed with information, sometimes very useful also. You would read where to eat for less than 1,000 lira in Milan, which back then was already very difficult, where to get free legal aid, what to do in case of a coup d'etat. And sometimes also just pure glossolali crans. You know, there is like the section of the mail of one of those magazines that says, we are not going to answer to you guys who are just too lazy and just leave us in peace, you know. So, but still, it was, you could just sense and you could just picture how these people were congregated in some obscure places, and it was funny. One of those magazines was called Fallo. Of course, it was imported from Jerry Rubin, right? Do it, right? But fallo in Italian means a couple of other things. One is, you know, when you cry fall, but also fallos, right? So, so another weapon, of course, was irreverence. And the novelty, as it has already been pointed out by my colleagues, was that it was intelligently directed in a reflexive mode, an irony that kind of countered the heroics and the intransigence of some of the 68 priests, and also touched the tics and poses of budding revolutionaries and their myths. And some pretty good stuff was there, like this Mao Zedong in bed with a man first, and then totally mistreats the maid and says, questo tè fa schifo, Baldracca. But then she says, but it's been made by the comrades in the province of, just tell them to fuck themselves. So this is Mao, right? And also, some freedom for the comrades arrested for having distributed this flyer. Almost kind of a self-fulfilling shortcut, perhaps also directed towards those who want to be martyrs, but ironically effective in today's world. Imagine just trying to distribute this in the Red Square and you'll be arrested on the spot, of course, right? Well, Matteo spoke already about this, but perhaps I can use it in a different fashion to arch back to my previous point, which is that we are dealing with cliches, but at the same time, Echaurren is exposing them in this kind of free, recombinable fashion. This arrangement which affords several recombinations and somehow recalls also the nearly uncontrolled proliferation of the various voices. So that's why I think that for me this little squares characteristic of part of a production of Echaurren, so playful, colorful, sometimes almost naively, so obviously recollecting the visuals that we had from comics, etc., but also stand for a kind of a panoptic gaze over this ephemeral, casual and transgressive galaxy. The point was precisely to try to seize it all, to kind of as a chaotic weapon and as an anonymous, indeterminate yet exuberant form of expression. So in this sense, I really find telling that this hanging strategy of the Echaurren show at Arturo Schwartz booth at an Art Basel of 73. So it seems particularly apropos, you have this kind of panoramic play that shifts up a level. And so the mosaics of little squares become now new element of an even more extended surface. A few years earlier, in 1963, Nanni Balestrini, poet Nanni Balestrini, in his collection Come si agisce, had somehow anticipated display with orders of magnitude some of his previously composed poems, including one that was combinatorial and computer-generated, Tape Mark I. So in itself, a product that afforded combinatorial explosions, become elementary blocks of a larger patchwork poems. Somehow Balestrini wrote about this specific visual that I'm showing you, which is like a map on how to rearrange the poems in a physical fashion. He says, the poems that compose each of the 4 long poems of this book unfold on a flat surface. Considered in this way, different relations and orders of reading emerge among them. So imagine this kind of this imaginary surface that keeps open together all the pages simultaneously in a kind of Dasebau wall. So somehow not only anticipating of those walls that would then be in the cities of Beijing, of Paris, and in Italy, but also somehow as a how to look at them, in the sense that it can be understood as a figure of this kind of simultaneous enactment, this extreme solicitation towards an immediate grasping, kind of a subitizing of an extended whole, of complexes to be grasped as elements of somehow of a higher, more chaotic order. This is, of course, an excess both for the naked eye and for the inner eye, but yet is offered as a topography to be flown over, just like the quadratini of Echaurren. So this, in short, is what I discern. And by the way, Echaurren then was also did also the cover of one of Balestrini's books. So this is what I discern in Echaurren's plays, an incitement to seize, even in cacophonic and choral fashion, the beauty of the ensemble of those uncoordinated episodes, at the time accompanied by the hope, if not the certainty, that they would open a breach in reality. So I believe that this letter from Adriano Spatola to Echaurren also conveys a kind of total trusting credit extended to the possible in a world objectively that was already gone to pieces. As to how these weapons were best to be used, well, this is for me emblematic. It packages 2 citations. One is visual, of course, is all these famous Duchamp objects. And one is textual, because here it says, Duchamp di sinistra, rifacciamo la storia dell'arte con la sinistra, meaning with the left hand, because you see that the clumsy drawings have been drawn with the left hand. This is from Walter Benjamin's famous sentence that all decisive blows will be struck with the left hand. So I've told you about mainly drawing zines and magazines, but to this varied textual flora, there was joined an even richer fauna. Behind every typographic oddity, behind every page of eccentric manifestos, there were at least 2 or 3 strange guys, strange types, Nonetheless, with freedom of action, maneuver, each capable of some magic, and I must say that perhaps this environmental possibility of the existence of the strange, of the freak, is one of the things I miss the most. Do I have time for a small anecdote to conclude? 1 minute? So once I was 14, I went to Parco Sempione, and a friend of mine who was more in the know said, do you want to meet Cochise? So the Indiani Metropolitani, sometimes the some of them had names like Geronimo, Cochise. I said, oh, who wouldn't want to meet Cochise, of course. And so he points at a guy in the distance. He's perfect. He, in fact, looks like straight from a Sergio Leone spaghetti western, as an Indian that appears in those Sardinian environment when Italian westerns were drawn. Very tall, kind of with his gait. Yeah. But as soon as I get there and I get closer to him, I see already from the way he gazes, the guy is completely gone. The guy is just as dumb as a rock. He just starts talking, etc. So I look at my friend and say, well, you know, Cochise, one of the Indiani Metropolitani who went into drugs, and then when the Carabinieri were about to seize him with a bag of acids, he decided to enact his greatest performance by gobbling them all in order not to be arrested. I don't know if the story is real or spurious. I don't know if that was Cochise. It's just another tiny little quadratino that adds to that mosaic for me. So with that conclusion.
And then finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Andreas Petrossiants, who is a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Performance Studies here at NYU, where he's researching anti-eviction, squatting, and tenants movements. He's a widely published author and is also associate editor at Efflux Journal. So please join me in welcoming Andreas.
Thank you, Ara. Thank you, everybody. Widely, I don't know, huh? Widely published. Dove lo trovo? Eccolo. So maybe I'll start with an anecdote as well, because I loved how you ended that. So I got to interview this guy who was in Potere Operaio. He was actually the how do you say, the typographer, the one who pressed it. And he was involved in the squatting movements in Florence. And he says the whole point was that squatting was meeting a need. And at some point we wanted to move from needs to desires. And I said, well, what does that look like? What is the move from needs to desires? And he goes, well, that's the move from socialism to communism. That's the last little step. And I bring this up to say because Echaurren in 1977 occupied a house in Rome on Via, mi ricordo, right across the street from the Castello, whatever, Sant'Angelo. And he says very clearly in a text announcing this occupation that this is not to meet needs of the people. He's very irreverent about it. And he says, this house is just for me and my friends to hang out and make art. And in some sense, one could read that as a sort of rejection and almost like a conservative, this rifuso privato, like my things, my stuff. And there's other terms for this, like Veronica Gago has the neoliberalization from below. Benjamin Holtzman talks about popular marketization. And I think a lot of these terms sometimes put too much credit on the hands of people who are involved in this shift to privatization, right? So if something is a means of survival, just because you're adopted by the market doesn't mean you wanted to marketize it, right? So I think that's putting maybe a little bit too much blame on Echaurren. What I will say is the difference between 68 and 77 that Ara kind of pointed to at the beginning of his talk, it's kind of hard to see. Right? So let's imagine that we're sitting in an archive looking at zines produced in 68 and zines produced in 77. Sure, we could start to pick up certain qualities, but if you're far away, they might look exactly the same, right? Hammer and sickles, fists. What would be different, though, is an artistic work emerging out of those scenes. And I think that's why people like Echaurren are very important, right? They can help us see differences that are otherwise obscured by both capital abstractions, so what I'm talking about here, like this neoliberalization, but also by political modalities that remain the same, even though the targets of struggle remain different. So my talk is going to be a little bit out of the blue because it's not really about Echaurren, but it's more the prehistory to Echaurren. So between 68 and 77, what's happening, right? So, yeah, and I will say furthermore that I think thinking about Echaurren through what I'm about to say can help us add another example for considering things like Boltanski and Ciavello's new spirit of capitalism, this argument that art was very much a part of this transition to a new creative capitalism, a new cultural production as production, right? So, In November 1970, one of the most prominent extra-parliamentary Marxist organizations operating in the legacy of operaismo, Lotta Continua, launched a movement program called Prendiamoci la città, Take Over the City, with the aim of overcoming horizontal differentiation between different subjects exploited by capital through housing struggle. So putting some of operaismo's discoveries into militant practice, they set the stakes of cross-sector and cross-class collaboration very clearly. It is this in-depth, they write, collective class analysis that gradually helps to develop the conditions for the proletariat's political organization. As they write, Lotta Continua, in their mythic text from 1972 summarizing urban action, which was translated into English for Radical America, this unified struggle around housing has been the precondition of the extension of the fight into other areas, such as transportation, health, and prices. Right? So this is the taking of struggle from the factory and from the university and bringing it out into other places, especially sites of consumption, I would argue. Rather than isolating wage and consumption struggles, extra-parliamentary organizations and autonomous militants and workers' councils attacked the state as well as reformist left-wing institutions beholden to the post-war productivist order. And they did this precisely through the uniting of student, labor, feminist, artistic, and other movements at sites of consumption. In the summer and fall of 1974, when private transportation companies in Torino increased ticket prices, commuters took matters into their own hands. In collaboration with the radical sections of official trade unions, they issued and printed their own tickets. Commuters blocked bus routes, while representatives from the unions collected discounted fares, prepared receipts, and delivered the reduced fees over to the companies. Autoriduzione was the name given by militants for actions in which, quote, consumers in the area of consumption and workers in the area of production took it upon themselves to reduce, at a collectively determined level, the price of public services. It was clear to the participants that wages, I think I have an image of it somewhere, yeah. It was clear to the participants that wages and the prices of goods were structurally related to one another, right? One leaflet accompanying, and I think this is incredible, one leaflet that was accompanying auto reduction actions in Milan exclaimed, "The goods that we have taken are ours, as is everything that exists, because we have made it with our exploitation," which is an incredible line, right? So we're talking about people looting a giant department store, the UPIM in Milano, and they're saying, and these are perhaps unemployed people, housewives, et cetera, not specifically the workers who produced those commodities, but they're saying our social labor, the labor that we've put into the social factory, has produced these commodities, so we're taking them. The important thing to remember here, and a lot of people start the history of Autoriduzione with this action in Turin, right? When people changed, practically changed the price of bus tickets. But it actually starts much earlier, I would say 71, 72, with mass squatting actions that already began to use this word. In a lot of cases, these were public housing units that the government was just refusing to distribute to people on a waiting list, and people would just come and take them, right? So feminist critiques of the capitalist division of labor being developed by numerous groups at the time, often in direct contestation of the sexist practices of certain militant organizations, were materially expressed, I would argue, in these housing occupations, rent strikes, and Italian industrial centers. In Naples and Palermo, for example, women took to the front lines of the housing struggle, including clashes with the police. And at the large housing occupation in Falchera, in Turin, as Monica Chirico writes, they had a self-managed women's clinic, which had doctors and medical students who aimed to provide women with information about and access to contraception and even abortion, although the latter was still illegal in Italy at the time. So, as Harry Cleaver notes, the feminist movement keenly grasped not only the theoretical concept of the social factory, but also the key role of struggle of non-factory workers. The movement's most enduring legacy may be its articulation of how the value form acts across the borders of production and reproduction. Leopoldina Fortunati's canonical The Arcana of Reproduction, recently translated brilliantly by Arwen Austin and Sara Colantuono, is a key text in that it consolidated a decade of feminist militancy, rigorously analyzing the relation between socially reproductive labor and the wage. Under post-war capitalism, she writes, quote, "The wage is no longer exclusively an expression of the coercive power that ties capital to the waged working class, but rather it becomes also an expression of the capitalist command and discipline of labor that is not directly waged, first and foremost of domestic labor. The wage thus becomes a cover for the exploitation of the house worker. So in Arte-Azione actions, especially squatting actions, by attacking not only the price of goods, but re-signifying how things are valued socially, remember the line, we have made it with our exploitation, auto-reduction points in the direction of the communization of the relations of production, circulation, and reproduction from this feminist Marxist perspective. So 77 is a key year for a lot of reasons. In a forthcoming book, Jacopo Galimberti and Steve Wright described that 77 was a year of crisis for the tens of thousands of Italians seeking revolutionary social change. It was in the first place a crisis of political militancy, they say, but one which for many led to a radical redefinition of political practice rather than its abandonment, right? So that's where Echaurren comes in. And we could also think about other groups that were sort of the bridge between these two moments. So Radio Alice in Bologna, Traverso, and the Anni Metropolitani, which we've talked about. On either side of this year, we find different modalities of both capital accumulation and urban resistance. As Raffaella Perna describes, by looking at Echaurren's work and its resonance with later movements, like the anti-globalization movement, that we can see like a series of steps in a longer history of the relationship between cultural production and militant expression. So thinking about it from the urban perspective, let's think about 77 from the perspective of New York. So the preeminent case for historicizing the neoliberal shift in New York City is the 1975 fiscal crisis. Another approach, however, is to look at the seismic gap between what happened during two electrical blackouts, one in 1965 and the other in 1977. In 1965, the blackout, which was much larger and affected much of the northeastern United States, the general mood seems to have been calm. The crime rate, as is often noted in passing, was very low, and there was apparently a huge baby boom. So 9 months after this blackout, there was a humongous amount of babies. So people were busy hanging out. At the time, some might speculate, significant public spending compelled workers into good behavior, right? So 18 public hospitals, completely free, after-school programs, humongous investments in public housing, et cetera, et cetera. But I would say that this is backwards. It's rather that struggle had forced capital to acquiesce to provide these things. But capital went on strike in 1975, famously. So 1977 was a very different story. Landlords in the Bronx and elsewhere were burning their buildings to collect insurance payments. Hospitals had been closed. Public universities had instituted tuition for the first time in their history. Social services had been axed, et cetera, et cetera. The darkness of the blackout created the conditions for a riotous expression, the form of which would become a prominent site of working class struggle in the decades to come. Direct attacks on sites of consumption and circulation. 50 Pontiacs at a Bronx dealership were driven right off the lot. Medicine, food, clothes, electronics, and other necessary supplies were collected and redistributed. As memorialized in the refrain in Nanni Balestrini's poem Blackout, New Yorkers seem to declare, quote, "We're going to take what we want, and what we want is what we need." And we can compare that to Echaurren's Casa del Desiderio. My contention is that sites of consumption are not only prime terrains of anti-capitalist contestation, because they offer a site for the devalorization of commodities, just taking them, but because in so doing workers and others can contest the structural relations between the price of consumer goods, public services, housing, the wage, and so on. And I'll remind everyone that creativity is a fundamental element here. Balestrini has a whole section in the Blackout book where he talks about a guy who had to sell a saxophone because he couldn't afford rent. And then the second the blackout happened, he just went back and stole a saxophone, right? So he can play music again, right? Also, the kind of the myth of how hip hop was invented was during the 77 blackout, a lot of people in the Bronx stole turntables and they started to have parties, and that's where hip hop kind of begins. So we cannot separate actions like this from creativity, which I think is where Echaurren again sits in that space. So compared with the 1977 looting actions in New York City, in the Italian cases that I was referring to, instances of the mass devalorization of commodities were explicitly tied to attacks on the reproduction of value and the reproduction of labor. This is Jamila Wheeler and I forget their first name, Squire. They write, while looting, the withdrawal of rent, or shoplifting for that matter, are clearly not exclusive tactics belonging to communist militants, Arte-Azione refers to politically conscious attempts to incorporate these tactics into anti-capitalist strategy. So I was going to talk a little bit about zines. Maybe I'll just say one last thing about the zine that you meant, or the flyer that you mentioned at the very end, the one that says, if you're reading this, you're going to be arrested. Free the comrades arrested for handing out this leaflet. I was looking at that this morning as well, and I was reminded of this excellent paper by Mikkel Rasmussen where he talks about Occupy, and he says, Occupy Wall Street, and he says, it can't be an accident that the greatest technology that came out of Occupy Wall Street is the mic check. So if anyone knows what the mic check is, you're at a protest, somebody wants to speak, but there's no megaphone. So you say mic check, and then everyone says mic check. Say mic check, everyone says mic check, and then I start to speak and you repeat what I'm saying. We make a human microphone. And that might be the only successful thing to come out of Occupy if we really think about it. It's a form of communication. I think in some ways, Rasmussen is there as making fun of this, saying like, is that all we got from all of this? But maybe a form of communication, a form of addressing each other, a form of creating some form, some new kind of language is exactly the point, right? So I'll just leave us with that. Thank you.